Hello and welcome to another Music Ally Focus with me, Music Ally's editor Joe Sparrow. And in this Focus episode, we're joined by Michael Horan, Last FM's VP of Product. Now, Last FM are just about to hit a remarkable milestone with 20 years as a music tech company. And in that time, it has gathered an enormous amount of data on how people listen to music. So we wanted to talk to Michael about what Last FM has learned from a music business that has changed dramatically over 2 decades. Now, what is this Focus podcast? Well, Music Ally, as you know, provides an analysis-rich and contextual guide to the music business. And each of these episodes analyzes one meaningful story at a time, and it's also going to be quick. This podcast should take about the same amount of time as Jack Lepiards of the USA could hypothetically crack a bullwhip 7,500 times. He achieved 298 bullwhip cracks in 1 minute in 2020. Now, talking of getting cracking, let's get on with our interview. Last FM is now 20 years old, and Michael Horan has been part of the company for over half of that time. And he's seen huge changes both internally and externally. Last FM has grown from a company that tracked what you're listening to in both MP3s and CDs to what you listen to everywhere online now. And it's in a rare position to have been operating in music tech for 2 decades. So in this podcast, part of a partnership between Music Ally and Last FM, we ask him about what Last FM has both witnessed and brought to the music business. He also talks about the changes in how data has been used over this 20-year period and what changes might be needed so that the data that the music industry requires can continue to be used in innovative ways to help build communities and connect artists with audiences. Okay, let's get over to our interview with Michael. Okay, we're joined by Michael Horan, Last FM's VP of Product. Hi, Michael. Thanks for joining us.
Hello. Thanks for having me.
Great to have you here. Now, first of all, let's acknowledge something that Last FM is 20 years old. That's a big anniversary in any terms, but in particularly in music technology. That stretch of time feels, in that sense, remarkable because so many platforms have been and gone in that time. So let's just start by taking stock from that perspective. As you look back at 2 decades of the platform, what do you think are the big things that Last FM has brought to the music business in that time? Whether that's innovations or technologies or just a mindset, what is it?
Yeah, it is impressive. 20 years of anything seems to be pretty incredible. When we started out, frankly, the reason that we did start out was to keep track of what people were trying to discover on the available platforms. At the time, this predates iTunes. Streaming services in general were pretty small. They didn't have that widespread adoption. So, being able to track what people are listening to from these disparate sources was really important because you wouldn't be able to remember what you would listen to, and there's such a huge variety. People went from having small collections at home of CDs or vinyl to the internet full of all music ever. So that's really how we started. And, that kernel still exists in us. Our primary function is to keep track of people's listening histories across all available platforms and keep it in one dedicated repository. So the industry has changed, as you say. There's been so many services that have popped up and faded away. And for us, the one consistent thing is that we're still here and we're still doing what we have always wanted to do, which is allow people to keep track of everything they're listening to. So we started as well as a radio service, which we no longer do. And that was arguably a good decision on our behalf because we were the first global service, and we introduced this idea of a lean back listening experience where you could passively choose your favorite artist and immediately initiate a never-ending stream of music that was related to that. And the more you listen, the better the listening experience became. And we've seen people who listen to music are no longer just pleased with this lean back experience. They want to be more engaged and more involved in how the music is playing. So it's just important to remember that when we started, none of the current climate existed, and we were pretty much one of a handful of services that offered music to people that weren't tied to a specific catalog. It was as wide as the imagination could be. It used to be where you were told what to listen to, and now it's become a place where you decide what you're going to listen to. And that's a really big distinction in the way that listening has changed over the past 20 years.
The service you've described, which is almost taken for granted now, which is we track your listening history. I think when most people think of that now, they think of it in one particular platform. Like they consume music over here and it's all recorded somewhere. It sounds like an obvious question, but I think it's one we don't think of, which is, and it explains the longevity of Last FM, which is people still want this. So why do they want that? What does it present to them that maybe they're not aware of by having all their listening history grouped together? What is perhaps happening that they're not aware of?
So before 2002, when we first launched, people would listen in many disparate ways. They'd listen through their CD collections of friends. They'd listen on the radio. They'd listen, in stores, or go to a local record shop and, hear new music that way. All of this, it was a very sort of transactional experience where you were given a very small selection and you had to choose without really being able to know what you were hearing. You had to choose what you would invest your money in. Obviously, at the advent, around the turn of the millennia, things changed a bit with peer-to-peer, and that really wreaked havoc in the music industry at large, because suddenly, people were stealing music, but also people were given limitless access. Last FM allowed you to keep track of that limitless access and effectively reduce the catalog from everything to things that were interesting to you. So as streaming services, DSPs, whatever, as they come and go, we're able to go with you. We become somewhat like a musical passport. So people who are going between, video sites and a streaming service and their local collection on their computer, all of these places, we're there and we're able to track what you're listening to. So it isn't just, this assumption that everybody listens on a single platform and they only listen that way, and that streaming service or that service in general has all the information they need about you, when in reality, you're going other places. It's similar to going to a friend's house or going to a record store or going to a gig. People don't listen one way, and they want to keep track of that no matter where they are. So we're able to do that, and for 20 years, we've managed to follow people between, services that no longer exist or services that, have a variety of offering. There's, I think there's some services right now that do a very good job of being very niche oriented, where they're looking at very specific things, where people aren't necessarily publishing their music on the big DSPs all the time because they realize their engaged audience, is somewhere else. So there's this infinite amount of choice that sometimes really affects how people approach it, whereas they don't. They don't necessarily, they can't find it. They can't cut through that noise. They're stuck in whatever realm they're sort of being moved into, whereas with us, we follow them. We don't tell them where to go. We just follow them along. So there's something, it's an incredibly passive thing, scrobbling, what we call it, tracking your music. It's very passive, but when you then can come back and see what you've done and reflect on what's happened, you have a better sense of where you're going to go next.
That's the interesting point, isn't it? That you've been scrobbling data for decades, plural now, which is something to think about. I mean, that's a lot of data. It's a frightening amount of data in some ways. What have you noticed about how that data is used over the time? Maybe changes, but how it's used perhaps from the listener's perspective, but also people and businesses that plug into that data and try and find things in it. How is that changing and what's it used for?
It's a great distinction. There's personal user listening data and there's that aggregated global data, right? And of course you can segment it any way you want, but a lot of our focus historically has been on the user's personal data, where, our point is to track what they're listening to help them move forward in their musical journey. And that is, something that's definitely consistent in what we've done. The personal data is everything for us. The global data is something that's a byproduct, and it's incredibly valuable. And we've seen a lot of services, a lot of companies that have grown over the past 20 years, and a lot of them have been acquired by other music services to help pad their offer, to give more insights to, say, artists or to labels, in order to give them a better sense of where their music's being consumed. That's all great, but what we're doing is by focusing on the user's listening history and giving them the insights that they need, they have constant access to their entire listening histories. And that distinction is really important because we're seeing more and more that music listeners are interested in what data they're offering up, and they want control over how that data is used. And a lot of the time, what we're trying to do is give them the tools to reflect and see what their trends are, see what things have changed in their lives that have affected their listening histories. So in terms of the byproduct, we have powered most services over the past 20 years, because we've been around such a long time. We were initially one of the few sources where people could get third-party music listening data, and a lot of the time right now, there's these weird distinctions that happen where there's, it's considered proprietary data, like our data is our data, nobody else can have it. And, that's definitely a business decision that people will make, and I understand that value. We're trying to unlock that in a certain respect because people's listening history is theirs. And we don't feel like we can shield our users from accessing their own data. So it's really important for us that there's an openness to what we're collecting and how we're providing it. So the services that have come and been acquired in the past, it's great, and they've then been transitioned into meaningful tools for artists and labels to see who's listening to the music and how.
This is something which has been maintained throughout the 20 years, which is it's been that focus, as you said, on the users owning their data, that their behavior of music listening, which maybe is subconscious to an extent, they just want to listen to this and that, and then it's recorded, is theirs. And it can have consequences in the future if you so wish to plug that data into something else. What are the potential future uses for this kind of data that we haven't imagined yet? If I've been using it for that amount of time and I have all this data, it's incredibly meaningful. We're moving perhaps into a music industry where the use of music, it's going to be in virtual experiences. It's going to be in gaming. It's going to be interactive. It's going to be AI generated, and it's going to be Web3 music and decentralized. So where are the opportunities for that listening history to be used in these new places, do you think?
You hear a lot of people talking about, that artist is mine, like this ownership over unique music. You can't necessarily differentiate a pop fan from a metal fan from, a jazz fan. Like, they're all personal experiences to those users. And a lot of what our role should be, and is to a certain extent, is allowing people to connect based on those unique passions. So, in the future, it really does come down to what technologies develop for how people are able to explore and discover new music. We want to be able to facilitate those relationships between people. There have been dozens of marriages that we've been told about off the back of people using Last.fm. Like, that's how personal these passions are. If you have one of your favorite artists isn't very popular, but you find somebody else who has an equally passionate response to that artist, that's a deep and meaningful connection that we can facilitate. So I think a lot of what our role is going to be in the future is how do we identify these communities around how people's personal experiences reflect on their musical tastes, and it's not about my top scrabbled artist. It's about my top unique artist, right? And somebody who shares that passion for somebody that's unique or different. And you see it a lot. I feel for musical artists right now because they're spending more time being owners of their social profiles than creating music. And anything that we can do to help connect these passions together, whether it's with artists or other musical fans, like, that's a really important aspect that I think right now is being lost because so much effort's being put on, how many pieces of content am I producing a day, a week, a month, from an artist. And that's difficult to stay on top of and still maintain a level of creativity where you can create new music that then people will find. So I think Last.fm's role in the future will have to be, how do you maintain this log of what people are listening to and how that can combine people together. And organic growth of communities is part and parcel of what we've done. We see it all the time where suddenly a new concept of what a specific artist is, suddenly it becomes truth because enough people start talking about it in that context. That's important for us to try and empower users to grow communities around their shared passions.
Community building is obviously a huge focus of artists now and the fans. It's something that both ends want. They want a direct connection between the two. There's a reason that artists are setting up Patreons and Discord servers and building these direct connections, from financial reasons, but to the community. That's the point, isn't it? Do you think that fans or music listeners are becoming more conscious of what they do, their behavior, maybe in relation to their favorite artist, has an impact, has meaning?
Yeah. There's a certain level of prove it where I'm the biggest fan of X. With Last of M, I can prove that. And you see a lot of people getting into these arguments. Well, you don't know anything. You didn't start listening to this person until last year. We have proof of how big of a fan somebody is. We have proof of who discovered what first. And I don't want to say that we want to encourage that competitiveness, but at the same time, there is a certain level of authenticity, I guess, in our data where you can't really cheat it. Of course, there's ways to game, the amount you're doing, but that's transparent. You can't hide, if you just leave your computer running for 2 days and scrabble every second of the day, like that's obvious, right? So there's a certain level of authenticity in the data that we're collecting from users because there's timestamps, there's evidence to support whether or not you are a fan of an artist. And there's obviously troll behavior. We can somewhat limit that by saying you haven't listened to this artist, you can't say anything about the artist because you don't know anything about him. It's not in your history. And that's, we definitely are able to provide users with this authenticity that I think will follow them into the future wherever technology will take us.
It's interesting you say that because so many new technologies emerging at the moment around proof of fandom. I hate to bring NFTs into the conversation, but one suggested desirable use of NFTs is to say, okay, I was at that show. I was at Ed Sheeran's second show. I am a real fan. But there's also that thing, people are, in a more modern context, they're hanging around the waiting room before a launch of a new YouTube video. And, it would be interesting to see who really watched the video when it was first launched. And that has meaning in fan communities, doesn't it? I was there. I was part of it.
Yeah, and that's what we see people using our data for. There's a lot of plugins right now that are being used across a variety of digital platforms where that's exactly what happens. I actually did this, and we are the evidence.
Let's look at the present. In 2022, the music industry is a data industry and a tech industry as much as anything else now. You're able to look back at 20 years of data and have that sort of context. What sort of data does the modern music industry need? And is there any changes that could be made around data collection and analysis that would be useful?
Yeah, massively. Right now, everything is limited by the quality of the data that goes in. There, as I said, there's a known quantity of music that's out there, but every day there's, hundreds, if not thousands of new releases. And a lot of this, is provided with some level of, sleaziness, I'll say, remastered, reissue. Like it's just a means to pop it up in people's, periphery. But I think the big problem right now is the ambiguous artist names. There is no actual way, there's not a clean way to verify that a particular artist is the particular artist. You can have 13 Nirvanas if you wanted, and that's based on the fact there isn't really an international code of standards or something. I know there's a lot of initiatives, and people, especially in the past 10 years, have been doing a lot of work to resolve this fundamental issue. And it's still in progress. We would love to say that we have plans to be the best source of metadata going forward, but right now we're really limited by what we're receiving. So it'd be great if there is, everybody gets together and agrees that this is the standard for what makes, an artist, what makes a songwriter, and really just keeps people honest, instead of these games to, try and ride off the coattails of somebody else who's, done something in the past.
As with so many solutions to these kind of problems, it sort of feels like it should be simple, but it also is difficult. Getting everyone in a room and saying, come on, let's just sit down for a couple of days and figure this out, and let's all agree.
It seems like the simplest problem to solve, and that's why there's been so many people who have tried to solve it, ourselves included. And we continue trying to crack that nut. It's just a really complicated thing. And I mean, there are tens of millions, if not more, of artists. They're seemingly infinite, and the one strength I think of Last FM is if you were ever in a band or, had a friend 15 years ago in a band, the likelihood is we have information on them. It's interesting. And that's, I guess, going back to, being able to say, prove it. But, we had somebody start recently and he was shocked to learn that we have his albums, like we have his albums metadata on the site, and, people could theoretically discover him. And, that's the powerful aspect. The problem with it is if he had a shared name with a different artist, that, we wouldn't necessarily be able to resolve that. So part of the strength is in that infinite amount of data that's out there. But the hardest part is to clean it up and consolidate it in a meaningful way. And nobody has corrected that yet. And I wish I had the answer to it.
How confident do you feel that it might happen?
It will. It has to. And a lot of conversations, especially in the past 5 years, go back to, royalties and stuff. And it's critical to resolve that. There's a lot of people who are being, sidelined because they can't prove that their music is theirs. And if there was a solution, a lot of those conversations would be a lot simpler.
What have you learned about the needs of users then, looking at their data? When you speak to users of, let's say, streaming platforms now, they sort of assume that, I'm doing air quotes for the benefit of listeners, the algorithm is sort of taking care of them, if you like. It's going to present what they need. But I also wonder if there's a sort of growing idea that, well, I also want to discover for myself and stand out. I want to be a bit of a micro-influencer in my friend group. And how do you do that if you're relying on an algorithm? So what sort of things are like very modern consumers looking for in their experience, and how does data fit into that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question. I have seen recently a lot of articles suggesting that people are, dropping their subscriptions and going back to their local catalogs they're stored. And it's, that search bar paralysis where people just don't know what to do. Algorithms are very helpful, but they're not everything. The most powerful recommendation is a personal one. And that can't be lost. So that's, again, the sense of, I'll say peer-to-peer. I don't mean the technology to share files. I mean people talking about their musical taste. So really what we focus on is, what you've listened to and creating safe places for people to be able to communicate to one another, because that's the strongest connection that people will have with music. There is a general distrust for algorithms. They're very helpful. They're very useful as a starting place, but they're not everything. You're going to find that a lot of algorithms miss a lot. I'm confident that ours is fairly strong, but at the end of the day, it's more important for people to connect on a platform than to just trust in the algorithm. So the data that's missing is the user input, and that's part and parcel to our algorithm is, we pay attention to when people aren't interested in something. Just because I like a specific album by an artist doesn't mean I'm going to like all of them. There's an evolution when it comes to music, and it's important to distinguish, a song from an album from an artist, because those things aren't necessarily all connected. It's a great place to begin, but if I'm not interested in this other album, don't tell me about it later.
What we're talking about here repeatedly is community. And as you say, fans grouping around an album or a cluster of albums or a small scene, a micro scene. It's one of the things that a lot of the big incumbent streaming platforms, for instance, have shied away from. They don't want to introduce that into the mix. But it definitely feels like something that is desired by fans and artists. And is that something which is going to be fulfilled in the next few years?
I would love to say yes. It's very important. Of course, it's a moderation nightmare. The fact it's the internet, and the internet is the internet. But I do think there are ways that you can approach it where you're not alienating specific users and you're not welcoming other types of users. I think, for the most part, people have shied away from it because they're more focused on, say, selling more music, and there have been community-based startups and companies that have come and gone over the past 20 years. And again, I'm not going to say that we have all the tools that, A, we want, or B, that we strive for, but, it's going to be a focus for us going into the future where we see these communities are being formed on Last.fm that, we didn't necessarily expect. And it's obvious that there is a need in the market for people to fill that.
Let's wrap things up with this simple question then. Let's look ahead to the next 20 years. What happens next for Last.fm?
I think it's going to be really important that we keep track of where the music industry is going in general. I think it's anybody's guess right now, and you alluded to a lot of these things, Web3, the metaverse, the blockchain, all of these sort of buzzwords right now, we're taking a keen interest in, and we just want to ensure that we're there and focus on us being where people are consuming music. We just want to continue tracking what they're listening to. There are a lot of other threads that we could pull at, but I think, the most important thing for us is to be where users are and allow them to just continue aggregating all of their plays, all of their passions in one place, and see what we can build on top of that.
That's a good place to leave it. And maybe if we're still in these positions and still around in 20 years, we'll be having this conversation and we'll see if that has actually happened or not.
The industry changes so quickly, I doubt it.
Let's hope so. Okay, Michael Horan, thank you ever so much for joining us.
Thank you.
All right, and that's it. So big thanks to Michael Horan for joining us from Last.fm, and there are plenty of links just below the podcast so you can check out some of the things he mentioned in that interview. If you found the podcast useful, please share it on with someone else who you think will get something out of it. And if you'd like to email me, you can. It's joe@musically.com. We also have a free weekly email, The Knowledge, which rounds up bits and pieces of analysis, news, marketing insight, and skills from Music Ally. You can find the sign-up link somewhere beneath the podcast as well. So that's it from me, Joe Sparrow. Until next time, farewell.